This week, Iran's state mouthpiece Tasnim quietly published an article most editors filed under "More saber-rattling from Tehran." It demanded fees on the undersea cables carrying 20% of the world's internet traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The headlines called it a new front in economic warfare. But buried in Tasnim's own legal justification is a contradiction that exposes what the IRGC didn't want anyone to notice, and once you see it, every move Iran has made this week starts to look less like strategy and more like a regime running out of cards. Rewind to the early hours of Saturday, May 9th. Inside an editorial office in Tehran, a Tasnim editor uploads a piece titled "3 Practical Steps for Generating Revenue from Strait of Hormuz Internet Cables." Within hours, Fars News, the other IRGC megaphone, echoes the same message. The proposals are surgical. Force Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft to apply for Iranian permits, charge annual protection payments, hand maintenance contracts exclusively to Iranian companies. The number Tasnim throws at its readers is staggering. $10 trillion in daily financial transactions flow through these cables. Across the strait and the watch floors of U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, the signal lands differently. This isn't a policy proposal. This is a target list dressed in legal robes. Now zoom out. 72 days into a naval standoff that began on February 28th when Operation Epic Fury sent 600 Tomahawks and the B-2 fleet over Iranian nuclear sites in a single salvo. 60 days into Tehran's reckless closure of Hormuz, the choke point that carries 21% of the world's seaborne oil. 28 days into the American naval blockade costing Iran a reported $500 million every 24 hours. The conventional Iranian Navy has been gutted, 9 warships sunk in the opening hours of the war. Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, the man Tehran put in charge of choking the strait, was assassinated by Israel. Yet somehow the strait is still half shut, 1,500 merchant ships and 20,000 sailors trapped in a holding pattern of fear. So when Tasnim's article dropped on May 9th, every Western analyst with a security clearance was supposed to interpret it the same way the headlines did, as Tehran opening a new front, the digital choke point, to complement the maritime one. CNBC ran with 20% of global data weaponized. Business Today called it a $10 trillion choke point. Iran International, normally cautious, used the phrase digital power lever. That's what the world saw. But here's what they didn't see, and what makes Tasnim's article less a declaration of strength than a confession of weakness. To understand the trap Tehran walked itself into, you first need to understand the story the world has been telling about this conflict, because that story isn't wrong. It's just incomplete. The mainstream narrative goes like this. Iran lost the conventional war in 48 hours. Operation Epic Fury. The code name for the joint U.S.-Israeli campaign that started on February 28th, he deployed 2 carrier strike groups, 450 combat aircraft, and bunker busters that cratered hardened nuclear sites at Natanz and Fordo. By Sunday morning, 9 Iranian naval vessels had been sunk. Khamenei was reportedly hit. The integrated air defense network, the same one Tehran spent 2 decades and billions of dollars building, collapsed within hours. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, in a report Pentagon planners cited in their $50 billion supplemental budget request, calculated that the first 100 hours alone cost the United States $3.7 billion in expended munitions. The American taxpayer paid that bill. But Iran paid in something it can't replace: strategic depth. Then came the Islamabad talks on April 11th and 12th, 21 hours of negotiation mediated by Pakistan. 21 hours that produced nothing. Vice President Vance walked out and said it plainly: Iran rejected American terms. Reports later confirmed that senior IRGC figures, including Vahidi and Zolgadar, vetoed every concession Ghalibaf's diplomatic delegation tried to bring back to Tehran. Authority in the Iranian state had fractured. The diplomats no longer spoke for the men with guns. So on April 13th, Trump imposed the naval blockade. CENTCOM has intercepted 33 vessels. According to Lloyd's list, only 26 ships have slipped through. The Pentagon estimates the blockade is bleeding Iran of $500 million per day. And on May 5th, Trump launched Project Freedom destroyers escorting commercial shipping through the strait. 2 American-flagged vessels successfully transited under USS Truxtun and USS Mason on May 4th, dodging an Iranian barrage of small boats, drones, and ballistic missiles. None of the American ships took a hit. Maersk's Alliance Fairfax followed under naval escort. Hegseth, in a Pentagon press briefing the same day, told reporters the Iranians were embarrassed. They claimed to control the strait. They did not. That's how the story has been told for 72 days. Tehran is cornered. The IRGC is desperate. The cable threat is just the latest gambit from a regime running out of conventional options. It's logical. It's based on real facts, but it leaves something out. Before I show you that missing piece, you need to understand one technical detail about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, because without it, the reveal is just numbers. Here's the detail nobody on cable news mentioned this week. When Tasnim claimed sovereignty over the cables under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the agency cited the treaty selectively, and the part it left out is where the whole bluff falls apart. Article 79 of the Convention explicitly protects the right of all states to lay and maintain submarine cables on the continental shelf. The article does not require permission from the coastal state. It does not allow tolls. It does not allow exclusive maintenance rights. The only condition is that cable routes must be agreed in consultation, not approved unilaterally. Isaac Mater, Director of Research at NetBlocks in London, walked Radio Free Europe through the legal architecture in a report published this week. Her conclusion was blunt. Tehran's argument has, in her words, significant weaknesses. The Egypt comparison Tasnim leans on Cairo charges fees on cables landing on Egyptian soil does not apply. Egypt licenses transit and landing points on its own territory, and those agreements are entered willingly. Iran's position, Mater said, is more tenuous because Tehran does not own a significant stretch of the cable routes through the strait. Now layer one more fact on top of that. Iran refused to sign the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982. The Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris documented this explicitly. Tehran rejected the treaty on the grounds that it limited Iranian maritime ambitions. So, the same regime that walked away from UNCLOS 4 decades ago is now citing UNCLOS to claim sovereignty over cables Iran does not legally control in waters. Iran does not legally own against companies operating under a treaty Tehran refused to ratify. That isn't a legal argument. That's a press release. So why publish it at all? 3 of the sharpest analysts watching this conflict offer different answers, and the disagreement matters more than the consensus would. Dr. Iman Nasseri, Managing Director for Middle East Research at FGE Nexent in Dubai, told the Eye for Iran podcast this month that any agreement now is structurally impossible. The gap between what Washington demands and what Tehran can concede is unbridgeable. His base case projects oil markets recovering only to 60% of pre-war levels by late 2026, with disruption persisting well into 2027. Tasnim's article in Nasseri's framework is theater for the domestic audience proof to Iranian hardliners that the regime still has cards to play, even if those cards are bluffs. Bozorgmer Sharafuddin, former Reuters energy correspondent now at Iran International, reads it differently. In the same podcast, Sharafuddin made a striking admission. Tehran's actual closure of Hormuz in early March was, in his words, as much a surprise to Iran as to the world. The leadership did not plan to slam the door this hard. They escalated their way into a corner. And once you've shut the world's most important shipping lane, you cannot reopen it without looking like you surrendered. The cable threat Sharafuddin's logic suggests is not a new strategic front. It is a regime searching for any leverage point that lets Tehran walk away with dignity. Then there is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. CSIS doctrine on Iranian asymmetric warfare emphasizes what Tehran's own strategists call time as a strategic variable, gradual attrition eroding the political will of democracies. Under that framework, the cable threat is patient and deliberate. Tehran is opening a slow bleed front the United States cannot easily counter because cutting an undersea cable is cheap, deniable, and devastatingly hard to attribute. 3 credible analysts, 3 different readings. Nasseri sees domestic theater, Sharafuddin sees a regime improvising, CSIS sees long-game doctrine. They have access to the same data. They disagree because each weights a different variable. Nasseri weights market signals, Sharafuddin weights regime, psychology, CSIS weights doctrinal pattern. If Nasseri is right, the cable threat dissolves the moment Iran finds a face-saving ramp out of the war. If Sharafuddin is right, expect more wild improvisation strikes that look strategic but were decided in panic the night before. If CSIS is right, the next 30 days will see actual sabotage probably attributed to a fishing trawler or anchor drag hitting AAE-1 or Falcon. The observable event that will tell us who's correct is simple whether Iranian small craft activity concentrates near cable landing zones at Fujairah and Chabahar in the next 2 weeks. There is a 4th analyst worth bringing into the room. Anthony Cordesman, the dean of CSIS Iran Threat Assessment, has argued for years that any weapon and any type of force can be used in asymmetric, irregular, or hybrid ways, from a terrorist proxy to a nuclear weapon. His framing matters here because it removes the comforting Western assumption that there is a clear line between conventional war and infrastructure sabotage. For Tehran, that line has never existed. Tasneem's article is not Iran deciding to enter a new domain. It is Iran formalizing what its strategists already considered fair game. The Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris, in its detailed study of IRGC naval doctrine, documented that Tehran refused UNCLOS in 1982, specifically because the treaty would have constrained exactly this kind of layered multi-domain pressure. The legal framework Tasneem now ignores is the same framework Iran rejected 43 years ago for the same reason. Marcus Lowe, writing in response to a Bloomberg opinion piece by retired Admiral Stavridis, pushed back hard on the cyber and asymmetric-only camp. Operation Epic Fury, Lowe argued, proved that no single domain wins a war against Iran, only combined arms at industrial scale produces escalation dominance. By that logic, the cable threat is precisely the kind of asymmetric pressure that Project Freedom alone cannot fully neutralize. Air superiority can clear the strait of fast attack craft on the surface. It cannot clear divers and submarines on the seabed. Here is the synthesis the mainstream missed. All three readings converge on a single conclusion that destroys Tehran's image of strength. If the cable threat were a calculated long-term play, Tasneem would have built a stronger legal case. State-affiliated outlets in countries with serious legal apparatuses, China, Russia, even Egypt, have lawyers who would never have published an article citing a treaty the country refused to sign. The sloppiness of the legal framing is itself evidence. This is not a chess move. It is a regime broadcasting that it has lost the conventional fight, lost the naval fight, lost the air war, and is now reaching for the only remaining tool it has: the threat of sabotage against critical civilian infrastructure. Mater of NetBlocks put it directly. The legal arguments do not hold up, but sabotage via ships' anchors or diving teams remains within Iran's capabilities in the strait. Translation: Tehran is no longer trying to win the legal argument. It is signaling in advance what it plans to break, so that when the cables go down, deniability is preloaded. CBS News confirmed the operational backbone of that capability remains intact. Approximately 60% of the IRGC naval arm, the asymmetric force built for exactly this kind of warfare, survived Operation Epic Fury. Admiral Shahram Irani, Iran's Navy commander, announced just days ago that the Ghadir-class midget submarines, the so-called Persian Gulf Dolphins, are now deployed in operational positions inside the strait. 19 to 23 of these vessels, each 29 meters long, are sitting in waters 30 to 60 meters deep, too shallow for American attack submarines to maneuver, but perfectly engineered to drop divers, deploy mines, or rest on the seabed, waiting. Iranian state media describe them as trigger-ready. The fast attack craft fleet, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 small boats spread along Iran's 2,400-kilometer Persian Gulf coastline, completes the picture. This is the Mosquito fleet Tehran built precisely for this moment, the moment when conventional war is lost and asymmetric pressure is all that remains. The cables are right there, the submarines are right there, and the bluff is now public. So what happens if Iran follows through? This is where the abstract becomes personal. Start with energy. Amrita Sen, director at Energy Aspects, told CNBC last week that $80 to $90 per barrel is now the new floor for Brent crude, permanently higher, even if a ceasefire holds. Brent closed at $109.87 on May 5th. Every $10 move in Brent translates to roughly 25 cents at the American gasoline pump. The International Energy Agency, in its latest modeling, suggests a sustained closure of even 30 more days pushes Brent above 120 and U.S. gasoline above $5 a gallon. That is not a forecast. That is the price already locked into the futures curve. Jet fuel in North America has spiked 95% since the war began. USPS, Amazon, and FedEx have implemented fuel surcharges that show up on every package shipped to your door. In Europe, the math is uglier. Dutch TTF natural gas. The benchmark for European heating doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March, after Qatar Energy declared force majeure on LNG exports. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate cuts. The UK is now expected to breach 5% inflation this year. Bavaria's December heating bill. The price every German household pays for hot water. This winter depends on what happens in a 200 square kilometer stretch of seabed where 7 cables and 19 submarines now share the same shallow water. Now, layer the digital stake on top. Roughly 20% of global internet traffic and $10 trillion of daily financial transactions pulse through those 7 cables. AAE-1 connects Singapore, India, and Europe. Falcon links the Gulf to South Asia. If Iran cuts one and the Jerusalem Post confirmed Iran already struck data centers in Bahrain and the UAE during the war, repair operations could take months and cost millions. Cable repair ships need clearance to enter Iranian territorial waters under the very fee structure Tasnim just announced. Tehran has pre-built the leverage. Pull one cable force the West to pay for the repair on Iranian terms. The third stake is the one that hits you, the viewer, directly. If you are reading this on a smartphone right now, there is roughly a 1 in 5 chance the data packets carrying these words crossed one of those 7 cables on their way to you. If you bank with a multinational route cloud traffic through AWS Bahrain or hold a portfolio with global exposure, your latency, your transaction speed, and your portfolio volatility are all tethered to the seabed. Iran is threatening. The Stimson Center reported that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have already begun building a consortium for land-based cable routes, diversifying not just away from Hormuz, but away from the entire Iranian-adjacent seabed. That consortium is the loudest possible signal that Gulf states no longer believe the strait will fully reopen on its pre-war terms. They are voting with infrastructure. And infrastructure, unlike rhetoric, costs billions and takes years, which means the Gulf is betting Iran's threat will outlast the current war. This is the part the cable news headlines missed. The story isn't that Iran is opening a new front. The story is that Iran's neighbors, the countries with the most to lose, have already concluded that the old Hormuz is gone. Cable routes are being rerouted. Insurance premiums are being repriced. Shipping companies are accepting 40% surcharges as the new normal. The world is quietly rebuilding itself around a Hormuz that no longer works the way it did 6 months ago. And Tehran, by publishing Tasnim's article, just confirmed it knows that too. So here is what we just saw. A regime that lost the conventional war, lost the air. War lost the legal argument and lost its lead. Naval commander is now broadcasting through a sloppy article, citing a treaty it never signed. Exactly which civilian infrastructure it plans to sabotage next. In the next 30 days, 3 signals will tell us which way this is going. First, watch the AAE-1 and Falcon cable monitoring dashboards at Telegeography and NetBlocks. Any unexplained latency spike or routing anomaly near the strait is the precursor. Second, watch CENTCOM's daily blockade reports. If interceptions of small Iranian craft near cable landing zones rise sharply, Tehran is moving. Third, watch the Iranian rial against the dollar. If the regime senses no path to a face-saving exit, expect the rial to collapse first and the sabotage to follow within days as Tehran tries to convert military leverage into diplomatic concessions before the economic floor gives out entirely. Which scenario do you see playing out? Domestic theater, panic, improvisation, or doctrinal sabotage? Drop your prediction in the comments. The water always finds its own path, and right now the path leads through fiber optic cables most of us forgot existed. If this is the kind of analysis you came here for, the contradictions buried inside the headlines, the strategic logic behind the noise, hit subscribe. That's what we do here.